There's a line of text that flashes across the screen in Sheldon J. Plankton's very first episode, a tiny diagnostic readout that rates him as 1% evil and 99% hot gas. Roughly 25 years later, in his own movie, that same character sings about being born pure evil. The words tumbling out during a hypnosis-induced flashback to his crowded childhood, with his friends looking on. Nobody in the series ever squares that circle, and almost nobody talks about it. Tonight, we're going through all of it, from the casting room accident that basically invented his entire personality, to the wife who eventually decides she's had enough of being his sidekick, to the single detail about his eye that turns out to be more scientifically accurate than almost anything else in Bikini Bottom. I'm glad you're here for this one, so get comfortable. We'll be here a while, and if you haven't subscribed, it really does help us keep making these. Krabby exists for exactly this: long, unhurried dives into the corners of a show most of us grew up with and never actually sat down to think about. And Plankton might be the richest corner there is, because underneath the pratfalls and the tiny fists shaking at the sky, there's a surprisingly well-documented, surprisingly sad, surprisingly strange production history. So let's start where he almost didn't exist at all. Sheldon J. Plankton first appears on screen in the Season 1 episode, Plankton, which premiered on July 31st, 1999, only a few months after the series itself debuted. That makes him one of the original cast, present from the beginning rather than bolted on later the way some side characters were. He is, canonically, a copepod, which is a real category of tiny marine crustacean. And for a show that likes to play fast and loose with biology whenever it's funnier not to, that detail turns out to matter more than you'd expect. We'll get to why later. For now, the important thing is that Plankton was supposed to barely matter at all. Stephen Hillenburg's original series Bible from the mid-90s, the document he used to pitch it before a single episode existed, already had Plankton in it as a potential villain, sketched out very differently from the character that made it to air. But somewhere in the process of actually producing Season 1, the writer's room made a decision that, from where we're sitting now, looks almost unthinkable. They demoted him. Not cut him entirely, but scaled him down to a minor, occasional nuisance rather than a recurring antagonist. The series, as originally planned, did not need Plankton to be its main villain, because, for a long stretch, it didn't really need a main villain at all. It had Squidward's misery, and Mr. Krabs' greed, and Patrick's stupidity to run on. What changed that calculation was one specific person holding two jobs at once. Doug Lawrence, who performs Plankton's voice, has also written for it for most of its run. And it was his own writing and his own vocal performance that argued the character back up the cast list. That's a strange kind of leverage to have. Most voice actors read lines someone else wrote for a character someone else designed. Lawrence got to be the actor advocating for himself from inside the writer's room, episode after episode, until a character who was meant to appear once or twice became the series' most enduring antagonist. In an interview some years back, Lawrence has said, in his own words, that he is not just the voice, that he gets to help shape how the character is written and how he evolves over time, and that very few actors ever get that kind of experience. He's right that it's rare. Most shows don't let the guy doing the voice also be in the room deciding what the character believes. And by several accounts, Lawrence has described having to actively push back against the writer's room's instinct to keep Plankton as a one-note joke, a tiny, angry man who loses at the end of every episode and nothing else. He wanted more allowed in, whether you buy its later attempts at giving Plankton an inner life or not. And we'll spend a good stretch of this video weighing exactly that question. The fact that someone inside the building was pushing for it from as early as those first seasons is worth holding on to for a second, because it reframes everything that comes after. The sympathetic reading of Plankton that shows up decades later in his own movie wasn't a late career reinvention dreamed up by a marketing department chasing a spin-off. According to Lawrence's own account, it's something he was arguing for from very early on, long before anyone thought this character would ever carry a film by himself. Here's the detail that, once you know it, is almost impossible to unknow, and it might be the single best piece of trivia in this entire video. Doug Lawrence did not audition for Plankton. He auditioned for SpongeBob. He read the lead role using the exact voice that would go on to become Plankton's, the low, gravelly, oddly commanding voice you now associate entirely with a one-eyed villain shaking his fist at a fast food restaurant. Stephen Hillenburg apparently found it funny, in the specific way you find something funny right before you decide it doesn't actually fit. He's on record joking that he'd make it SpongeBob's voice if I had any guts at all, calling it silly, funny, and an over-the-top choice for the hero. As it turned out, the Sponge role already belonged to Tom Kenny, whose voice Hillenburg had fallen for years earlier from a small alligator character on Rocko's Modern Life. And right there in the audition room, laughing along with Lawrence, he realized the deep, silly voice in front of him wasn't the hero at all. It was Plankton. Think about how close that is to not happening the way it did. If Hillenburg had followed through on the joke, if he'd had, in his own words, the guts to cast the deep, growling voice as the good-natured, endlessly optimistic Sponge everyone eventually fell in love with, the entire tonal architecture of the cartoon shifts. Instead, that voice got reassigned, almost as an afterthought, to a character who was at the time barely more than a background nuisance, and the mismatch between the voice and the body is precisely what makes Plankton work. He's 2 inches tall by Nickelodeon's own official measurements, and he sounds like he should be running a shipping company or narrating a documentary about lions. This is the part that gets me about the whole story. The franchise's most enduring villain exists specifically because a joke about miscasting the hero got taken seriously about someone else instead. Lawrence has described exactly where that voice came from, and it's a small, specific alchemy. He's called it a combination of Thurl Ravenscroft's Tony the Tiger and the actor Gregory Peck, mixed with an impression of a real deep-voiced friend from his own childhood and high school years. He used a version of it sparingly, mostly in the background, on Rocko's Modern Life, where by his account, it consistently made Tom Kenny laugh on set, years before either of them had any idea it would end up as the voice of a copepod. The whole lineage is a strange, almost unplanned accident, a serial mascot and a Hollywood leading man and an old friend's voice filtered through a background bit on a different cartoon entirely, eventually landing on the tiniest, angriest character in Bikini Bottom. It isn't effortless to produce, either, even now, more than 2.5 decades in. Lawrence has said in interviews that making the voice requires him to physically form a pocket in the side of his mouth and bring it down as low as he can go, a specific muscular technique rather than a simple pitch shift he can just flip on. By his own account, it's become something close to muscle memory after this many years, but he's also said the screaming Plankton does regularly is physically taxing to recover from afterward. It's easy to forget, listening to a 2-inch cartoon villain shriek about stealing a formula for the 600th time, that there's a specific physical toll being paid by an actual human throat on the other end of it. Nickelodeon, for what it's worth, didn't initially see any of this coming either. According to production history compiled by Wikipedia's entry on the character, network executives wanted to cast a celebrity guest star for Plankton's debut episode, treating him as exactly the kind of disposable one-off character the writer's room itself had already decided he was. Hillenburg refused. He insisted that Lawrence's voice simply was the character, not a placeholder waiting for someone more famous to fill it in. It's a small institutional battle, the kind that rarely gets remembered once a show becomes as enormous as this one did. But it's the reason the villain you know sounds like the villain you know at all. What's striking, reading back through the interviews Lawrence has given over the years, is how early the softer red on Plankton actually shows up, long before the films gave the studio any commercial reason to humanize him. Years before any movie put Karen at the center of anything, Lawrence was already, by some accounts, describing Plankton as a complex, wounded character who is really looking for a friend in a way, but cannot let that happen because of his evil front. That's not a marketing line written to promote a streaming release. That's an actor, a decade into playing the part, telling a regional outlet exactly how he understood the character when nobody outside the fandom was likely to be listening. Whether the series around him always lived up to that reading is a separate question, and it's one we'll come back to more than once tonight, because the writing hasn't always agreed with its own voice actor about who Plankton is supposed to be. So that's where he starts, a nearly cut background character, saved by the one person in the building who is contractually obligated to keep believing in him, wearing a voice that was originally meant for the hero. Everything that follows, the family, the wife, the decades of failed schemes, the eventual movie built entirely around his marriage falling apart, grows out of that one accidental casting decision. Now let's talk about the other half of that marriage, because Karen's own origin story is, in its own way, just as unlikely. Karen debuts in the same episode Plankton does. Plankton, back in 1999, already installed as a wall-mounted supercomputer inside the chum bucket. Within the series' own internal mythology, according to the Wikipedia entry covering both characters, she was originally built by Plankton back in grade school out of a calculator, a roller boot, and a potato, then steadily upgraded through the rest of his education until she became the sleek monitor fans have watched bicker with him for over a quarter of a century. It's a strange little creation myth for an artificial intelligence, closer to a school science fair project than to anything resembling deliberate engineering, and it fits the cartoon's general refusal to take its own technology seriously. Karen isn't Skynet. She started as a potato with a calculator taped to it, built by a lonely kid who apparently needed someone or something to talk to. The real-world story behind her is where this gets genuinely moving, and it's one of those production details that recontextualizes a character the moment you learn it. Karen is voiced by Jill Talley, and Jill Talley is married, in real life, to Tom Kenny, the man who plays SpongeBob. That alone is a nice bit of trivia. Two spouses playing an antagonist and a hero on the same cartoon. But it goes a layer deeper than that. Karen was named after Karen Hillenburg, the real-life wife of the series creator, Stephen Hillenburg. According to multiple corroborated sources, Karen Hillenburg was originally supposed to voice the character herself. She sat down for the first recording session and couldn't get through a take. Too nervous. The role went to Talley instead, and the character kept the name of the woman who was never quite able to play her. There's something worth pausing on there that has nothing to do with jokes or schemes or Bikini Bottom at all. A computer married to the series' most enduring villain, a computer whose entire dynamic revolves around bone-dry sarcasm delivered at a man who barely deserves her patience, carries the actual first name of the creator's wife, a woman who tried to give the character her own voice and, for one afternoon in a recording booth, simply couldn't. It's a small, human footnote sitting underneath one of the most mechanical relationships in the whole cast, and it's the kind of detail that never makes it into a clip compilation because it isn't funny, it's just true. Karen's physical design hasn't stayed still across the run of the series either, and this is one of those things longtime viewers absorb without ever quite cataloging it. Segundo obgina de personagem na enciclopedia SpongeBobia, ela existe apenas como monitor fixo na parede ao longo das primeiras 4 temporadas do programa, preso ao balde de chumbo do jeito que se esperaria de computador de sitcom dos anos 90. She gains a mobile form, starting with the 2004 movie, freeing her from the wall for the first time. By around season 9, she's visibly been upgraded again, with robotic arms added to her chassis, and a later episode introduces a separate, further upgraded unit, sometimes referred to by fans as Karen 2. None of this is treated as a big narrative event within the story itself. It just happens, quietly, across all those years of episodes, the way a phone gets a new operating system nobody remembers agreeing to. That gradual physical escalation is worth flagging up front, because it becomes relevant again later tonight, when we get to her own movie, and the question of exactly how much independence and capability had been sitting inside that chassis the entire time. Waiting, Nickelodeon has actually given both of these actors dedicated space to talk about this relationship on the record through the network's own official podcast. One episode focuses on Lawrence himself, covering his roots in stand-up comedy and his earlier work on shows like Ren and Stimpy and Rocko's Modern Life. A companion episode turns the microphone over to Jill Talley, covering Karen's evolution as a character and the way the two actors ad-lib against each other in the booth. That improvisational chemistry becomes an important production detail once we get to the 2025 film, where, according to Talley herself, the two of them riff so freely during recording sessions that they sometimes have to be stopped. Lawrence has separately noted the practical cost of that habit because their ad-libbed lines tend to overlap. They've had to consciously leave space between what they say, or the dialogue becomes unusable once it's handed off for animation timing. Two actors who are, by every account, having a great time together in a booth, constrained by the reality that a cartoon still needs its mouths to move in sync with actual, individually timed lines. What's easy to lose, watching Karen needle Plankton across dozens of episodes about yet another failed scheme, is that this dynamic was never purely comic filler. It's a marriage built out of scavenged parts and a name borrowed from a real one, voiced by a woman married to the hero's own actor, evolving physically in the background of season after season of television until the writers finally decided to ask, directly, what all of that patience and upgrading had actually been costing her. We'll get there. First, though, there's a much stranger thread to pull. Because its most obviously cartoonish design choice, that single enormous eye, turns out to be one of the most unexpectedly accurate pieces of biology anywhere in Bikini Bottom. Sheldon J. Plankton is, again, canonically a copepod, and the writers didn't invent that word for flavor. Copepods are a real, well-documented category of small marine crustacean, and marine biologists classify them as a major component of zooplankton, the drifting layer of tiny organisms that much of the ocean's food web depends on. Real copepods are truly minuscule, typically somewhere between 0.5 millimeter and 2 millimeters, with a handful of larger species stretching out toward 17 millimeters at the outer edge. That range sits close to Hillenburg's original design intent for the character. According to production history documented on Wikipedia, Hillenburg initially wanted Plankton to be essentially invisible, matching real copepod's scale as closely as an animated show could manage. The animators overrode that instinct fairly quickly, for a reason that sounds almost embarrassingly practical once you hear it. A character that small simply wasn't, in the language used to describe the decision, conducive to him interacting with other characters on screen. You can't have a plot revolve around a villain nobody can actually see doing anything. So he got enlarged, not because anyone cared about biological accuracy, but because a truly microscopic villain makes for terrible television. And yet, having made that compromise, the series landed on something that tracks real biology far more closely than anyone probably intended. Real copepods have a single median eye, sometimes called a Doppler eye, positioned centrally rather than paired on either side of the head, the way most animal eyes are arranged. Plankton's single, oversized eye, the design element that reads as the most obviously cartoonish, over-the-top thing about him, the one-eyed monster look that seems purely built for a joke, is actually one of the more scientifically grounded choices anywhere in its character design. It isn't a stylistic flourish invented to make him look sinister. It's closer to an accident of accuracy, a case of the writer's creative license landing, almost by coincidence, on the thing biology actually does. The coloring holds up reasonably well too. Real copepods can appear transparent, pale, or tinted green, red, or blue, depending on the algal pigments they've absorbed from their diet, which gives Plankton's signature green at least a loose grounding in how these organisms actually look in the wild. And there's one specific gag, buried inside the Season 3 episode, The Algae's Always Greener. That fan commentary has picked up on, as an unexpectedly precise bit of writing, Plankton is shown eating something described as holographic meatloaf. Played purely for absurdity in the moment, it happens to track with how actual plankton generate energy in the first place, largely through photosynthesis, meaning a joke about eating a hologram, a literal projection of light, lines up with an organism that survives by consuming light to begin with. Whether the writers knew that when they wrote the gag is impossible to say for certain. Hillenburg's own background makes it plausible that somebody in that room did. That background is worth stating plainly because it explains a lot about why these accidental accuracies keep showing up. Before he created the series, Stephen Hillenburg held a bachelor's degree in natural resource planning and interpretation, with an emphasis in marine resources from Humboldt State University, and he went on to teach marine biology at the Orange County Marine Institute in Dana Point, California. In 1989, he produced an educational comic called The Intertidal Zone, built around anthropomorphized tide pool creatures, which functions as a direct thematic and character precursor to the cartoon he'd eventually create. None of that means every joke in SpongeBob is secretly a biology lesson. Most of them clearly aren't. But it does mean the man building this world had spent years actually looking at real copepods, real algae, real tide pools, before he ever sat down to design a fictional one. And Plankton's surname is really the plainest evidence of that habit sitting right out in the open. He isn't loosely inspired by Plankton the way a superhero might be loosely inspired by a spider or a bat. He's a direct, literal anthropomorphization of the exact taxonomic category he belongs to, named after his own biology with almost no metaphor standing between the two. Just how far the earliest version of this character sat from any of that is striking on its own. A pitch Bible Hillenburg produced in the mid-90s, scanned and preserved on the Internet Archive, shows a Plankton who barely resembles the one that eventually reached the screen. Among the pages, one appears to sketch out an early identification card for the character, giving him a more human-looking face with glasses and antennae, nothing like the single bulbous eye viewers know now, and what looks like some kind of elaborate vehicle design for him to drive. The one-eyed copepod design that turned out to accidentally match real marine biology wasn't the starting point at all. It's what the character became somewhere between that pitch document and the finished show, which makes the eventual scientific accuracy feel even more like a happy accident than a plan. Nobody sat down and decided to design the most anatomically correct copod on television. They just kept iterating on a joke until, almost by chance, they landed on one. None of that biology, though, tells you why this particular copepod has spent 26 years locked in a business war with a crab across the street. For that, you need to go back to a half-hour special that didn't air until 2007, 8 years into the series' run, called Friend or Foe? It served as the Season 5 premiere that year, and by most accounts, it was the first, and for a long time the only, season premiere of the main series to run as a full half-hour special rather than a standard episode pairing. For the better part of a decade, the writers had simply let Krabs and Plankton be enemies without explanation, the way sitcoms let two neighbors hate each other without ever specifying why. Friend or Foe is the episode that finally decided an explanation was owed. What it reveals recontextualizes basically everything that came before it. Krabs and Plankton, it turns out, were not always enemies. They were childhood best friends, and more specifically, they were both outcasts, bonded by circumstance rather than by choice. Krabs was mocked for being poor. Plankton was mocked for being a brainy know-it-all, the kind of kid other kids resent for being smarter than them. According to the episode, the two of them met while fleeing bullies and later worked together as employees at a soda shop under a boss named Old Man Jenkins. That detail alone reframes the entire rest of the series. Every single time you've watched these two scream at each other over a stolen formula, you've been watching two grown men reenact a friendship that started with them running from bullies together as kids. As adults, the special shows them attempting to start a restaurant together as actual business partners rather than rivals. And here's the detail that makes the whole mythology work. The Krabby Patty formula wasn't invented by either of them on purpose. It was an accident. Ingredients fell together into a pot while they were working, combined by chance rather than design, and what came out the other end became the most famous secret formula in Bikini Bottom. Think about what that actually means. It means the entire conflict that drives this franchise, the rivalry, the decades of sabotage, two restaurants perpetually at war, traces back not to a stolen idea or a betrayed trust, but to a kitchen accident that neither man actually planned. What happened immediately afterward is where the friendship actually breaks. The two of them fought over the formula, physically, and in the chaos the written copy got torn in half. Plankton ended up holding on to the smaller scrap, the part that reads, and a pinch of chum. Krabs kept the rest, the larger, more essential portion of the recipe. And because Plankton is, as we've already established, roughly 2 inches tall and built like a copepod, Krabs simply overpowered him physically. Not through cleverness, not through a better business plan, but through the plain fact that a crab is bigger than a copepod and can win a physical fight against one without much effort. Krabs kept the formula. Krabs kept the credit. And the friendship that started with 2 outcast kids running from bullies together ended with one of them literally muscling the other one out of everything they'd built. There's an argument to be made, and this is interpretation rather than anything the series states outright, that friend or foe quietly reframes Mr. Krabs as the actual aggressor in a relationship we've spent years being asked to read the opposite way. Plankton is the one who shows up in episode after episode, scheming, stealing, sabotaging, playing the villain role the writing keeps assigning him. But according to its own flashback, the original sin wasn't a stolen idea. It was Krabs physically overpowering a much smaller creature and keeping something the two of them built together by accident. That doesn't make Plankton a good guy, and the story never asks you to conclude that it does. But it does mean the power imbalance between these two characters isn't just physical comedy. The running gag of Krabs flicking Plankton off a counter or ejecting him bodily from the restaurant, it's baked into the actual founding event of their entire rivalry. It's worth being precise here about what this special is and isn't, because this is exactly the kind of territory where a script can accidentally smooth over something the series itself keeps messy on purpose. The Krusty Krab building's own origin is not, contrary to some fan shorthand, a single contradictory myth with 2 competing stories fighting for the same explanation. It actually offers several different stories touching on the Krusty Krab across different episodes, and only one of them, involving a bankrupt retirement home, is actually about where the building itself came from. The others, including Friend or Foe, are about Mr. Krabs' personal and business history rather than the structure's origin. In a separate episode, Grandpappy the Pirate, Krabs is shown to have owned and captained an actual pirate ship earlier in his life, which he later sold upon retiring from that career. And in that same episode, he dresses the restaurant up with props to look like a ship specifically to fool his own grandfather. Read carefully, that scene actually implies the Krusty Krab is not that old ship at all, since he has to fake the resemblance rather than simply pointing at the real thing. These are separate stories about separate parts of Krabs' life, not competing drafts of the same origin, and it's worth keeping them apart rather than flattening them into one tidy contradiction. Because the writers themselves never ask you to pick just one. There's also a second, much later origin beat for the Krabby Patty formula worth mentioning here, because it complicates the tidy friend or foe narrative in an interesting way rather than replacing it. The prequel spin-off series Camp Coral, SpongeBob's Underyears, which premiered on Paramount Plus in March of 2021, reimagines Plankton and Karen as the secret chefs running a hidden lab underneath the kitchen of a summer camp, a completely different day job from the chum bucket entirely. In the episode Kitchen Sponge, a young SpongeBob helping Plankton in the camp kitchen, credited there as the Krusty Canteen, leads the two of them to accidentally develop what the episode describes as a very familiar sandwich. That's a second, separate proto-Krabby Patty beat, developed with SpongeBob rather than with Krabs, sitting in a different corner of the franchise's timeline. Nobody has ever tried to reconcile these two origin stories into one clean sequence of events, and given how loosely SpongeBob treats its own continuity in general, that's probably the honest way to leave it. Two different accidental formula stories exist in two different corners of the franchise, and neither one erases the other. What friend or foe actually accomplishes, 8 years into its run, is turning a background rivalry the writers had been running on pure momentum into something with an actual emotional spine. Before this special, Plankton stealing the formula was just a setup for a joke, repeated so often it became furniture. After it, every theft carries the faint shadow of two lonely boys who found each other while fleeing bullies, a pot of ingredients nobody meant to combine, and a fight that one of them lost simply because he was smaller. The writing rarely brings that context back up directly in later episodes. It doesn't need to. Once you know it, you can't watch the rivalry the same way again. That emotional spine sits underneath a mountain of comedy though, and most of its run treats the rivalry as exactly that, comedy, an engine for one formula heist after another that resets to nothing by the closing credits every single time. Plankton knows the safe combination isn't the point. Winning was never really the point either, structurally speaking, because a show like this can't let its villain actually succeed and keep going. The formula's hiding place itself isn't even fixed. Fans sometimes remember it as living permanently under Mr. Krabs' mattress, and that detail does appear in more than one episode, including Plankton's army and the lost mattress. But elsewhere, it's kept in a safe or a vault instead. The hiding place shifts from episode to episode, depending on what the plot needs that week, which tells you something about how loosely the series treats its own supposed rules. And it's worth restating plainly, because it's one of the most common things comment sections correct. The formula was never Mr. Krabs' secret alone to keep. SpongeBob himself knows the safe combination, trusted with it directly by his employer, and in the first movie, Plankton actually succeeds in stealing and using the real formula rather than a decoy. The idea that only one crab on the planet holds the keys to this thing has never actually been true. Across those early seasons, the writers ran an entire subgenre of Formula of the Week episodes. Plots like FUN, where Plankton tries to lull SpongeBob into a false sense of friendship to pry the recipe loose, or the fake Krusty Krab training video, a parody instructional tape SpongeBob is shown that turns out to be Plankton's own propaganda in disguise. Plankton's army widens the scope considerably, bringing in an entire mass of his extended cousins to help pull off a heist, which is the first real hint that this character has more family than just a wife built out of spare parts, a thread we'll pick back up properly later tonight. One of the strangest entries in this stretch is the Algae's Always Greener from Season 3, which we already touched on briefly for its holographic meatloaf gag. The wider plot is worth laying out properly here, because it's the series' biggest what-if experiment involving these two characters, and it deserves more than a single line about food. Plankton invents a device that swaps his and Mr. Krabs' entire lives, not just their bodies, but their identities, their possessions, their whole social standing. Plankton wakes up as the owner of the Krusty Krab, complete with a nameplate reading Mr. Plankton and a framed family photo that inexplicably includes Pearl as his own daughter. Krabs, meanwhile, wakes up demoted to a lowly employee at the Chum Bucket, stripped of the wealth and status he'd built his entire identity around. The twist, and it's a fairly pointed one for a show this broadly comedic, is that neither of them actually enjoys the swap. Plankton discovers that having everything Krabs has doesn't make him happy the way he assumed it would, and Krabs discovers exactly how little he has once the restaurant is taken away from him. Both men want the reversal, and the episode gives it to them, resetting the world back to its familiar shape by the end. Read as interpretation rather than fact. The episode plays almost like the writers arguing, without quite saying so, that Plankton's entire obsession with taking the Krusty Krab was never really about the restaurant at all. He gets it, briefly, completely, and it solves nothing. The series occasionally pushes this formula theft premise somewhere stranger than a straightforward heist plot, and 2 episodes in particular are worth naming because they're the kind of thing a script built purely from memory tends to skip past. In the Krusty bucket, Plankton fuses his own Dina with Mr. Krabs to engineer a hybrid clone, a creature the fandom has taken to calling Plan Krab. Designed as a new weapon in the Formula War, it backfires immediately. The clone turns on its own creator, forcing Plankton and Krabs into an uneasy temporary alliance against the very thing Plankton built to defeat one of them. It's an unusually body horror adjacent premise for a show that mostly lives in the register of pratfalls and yelling. Genetic material from 2 lifelong enemies spliced together into something neither one can control. A similar beat, played more explicitly for laughs, shows up in Copybob Ditto Pants, where Plankton clones SpongeBob directly, hoping a duplicate will simply hand over the formula without any of the loyalty problems the original keeps presenting. One of the resulting clones, nicknamed Me Too, does the opposite of what Plankton wants. Rather than betraying SpongeBob, the clone bonds with him and refuses to cooperate with the man who created it. It's a smaller, sillier version of a theme this franchise returns to more seriously decades later. The idea of something Plankton builds specifically to serve him instead, developing a will of its own, and simply declining to. Karen's much larger, much more consequential version of that same beat is still a long way off in this story, but the writers had already rehearsed the basic shape of it twice in throwaway clone plot episodes most viewers remember as filler rather than foreshadowing. Even the tie-in video games got in on this pattern of Plankton's own schemes sabotaging themselves through his own carelessness rather than through anyone actually stopping him. In SpongeBob SquarePants Battle for Bikini Bottom, released in 2003, the entire robot uprising plot that drives the game hinges on a specific, well-documented mistake. Plankton's Duplication 3000 machine works exactly as intended, mass-producing an army of robots without any technical failure at all. What goes wrong is smaller and dumber than that. He simply forgets to flip one switch, the one labeled to make the robots obey him, and the entire uprising that follows is the result of that single, overlooked step rather than any grand betrayal or hidden flaw in the plan. It's a small detail, buried in a 2003 platformer rather than the series itself, but it fits the pattern this chapter keeps circling. Plankton's failures across this whole era rarely come from being outsmarted by SpongeBob or Krabs. They come from his own plans, quietly sabotaging themselves. One forgotten switch, one cloned creature with its own opinions, one swapped life that turns out to be hollow, at a time. All of that petty, self-defeating scheming makes what happens in 2004 genuinely remarkable. Because for one film, exactly one, none of it applies. The SpongeBob SquarePants movie gives Plankton the single most successful scheme of his entire career, a plan so thorough it actually works, and understanding why it works tells you a great deal about what this character is capable of when the story finally lets him win. The film, directed by Stephen Hillenburg himself, is generally said to have premiered in Los Angeles in mid-November of 2004, a matter of days before it opened wide nationwide. It was made on a budget of roughly $30 million and went on to gross about $141 million worldwide. A strong return for a film built around a cartoon that, at the time, most adults still assumed was strictly for children. Inside that film sits the culmination of what Karen, back at the Chum Bucket, refers to as Plan Z, the last entry in an alphabetical run of schemes that had apparently, by this point, exhausted every letter from A through Y. By some fan accounts, Plan Z also marks a turning point in how the series names Plankton's schemes going forward. After this film, The writers largely abandon the letter system entirely and start numbering his plans instead, which means Plan Z isn't just his biggest scheme, it's structurally the last of an entire naming convention. A small but real bookkeeping shift buried inside what looks like pure trivia. The plan itself is worth laying out in full because insane is actually the right word for how many moving parts it involves. Karen reminds Plankton of this forgotten, long-shelved scheme: frame Mr. Krabs for stealing King Neptune's crown, ensuring he gets sentenced to execution, which in this universe means being shrunk down and dried out into nothing. With Krabs out of the picture and the Krusty Krab left unguarded, Plankton steals the formula clean. No fight, no tearing a written copy in half, just a clear shot at an empty safe. He opens his own rival Chum Bucket using the real formula for the first time in the franchise's history, and then escalates far past simple business competition. Using mind control helmets, he enslaves the entire population of Bikini Bottom and renames the town Planktopolis. For however brief a stretch of screen time, the joke of a villain who never wins actually gets to rule the place he spent years failing to conquer. What stops him isn't a rival scheme or a change of heart. It's SpongeBob and Patrick, sent on what looks like a pointless, humiliating errand to retrieve the crown from Shell City, actually succeeding and bringing it back. The moment the crown returns, Krabs is exonerated, the townspeople are freed from Plankton's mind control, and Plankton himself is defeated and arrested. The film ends there, with him in custody. And it's worth being precise about that ending, because a specific alternate version circulates widely online that simply isn't accurate to what the movie shows. The idea that SpongeBob and Patrick end the film keeping a shrunken Plankton in a jar as a pet. That detail cannot be verified against the actual theatrical ending, which, according to the film's own plot record, has him trampled by the fleeing crowd and taken into custody rather than shrunk into a jar at all. If you've heard the jar version repeated somewhere, treat it as one of those details that spreads because it sounds plausible, not because it happened. What makes Plan Z worth lingering on isn't really the mind control or the renamed city, memorable as both of those are. It's what the scheme reveals about the shape of every other scheme in this franchise by contrast. Every other Plankton plot we've covered so far resets by the end of its own episode. A formula stolen and then immediately recovered. A life swapped and then swapped back. A clone that turns on him before it can do any lasting damage. Plan Z is the one time the reset takes an entire feature film's worth of plotting to arrive, the one time actual structural success is on the table before the story yanks it away again. And it never gets undone by Plankton himself. He doesn't lose because of a flaw in his own plan, the way he does in battle for Bikini Bottom with a forgotten switch, or because whatever he built turned against him, the way it does with the planned Krab clone. He loses because two characters everyone in universe treated as a joke, a sponge and a starfish sent on what was meant to be an unwinnable errand, actually pulled it off. Plankton's downfall in his single biggest win isn't his own failure at all. It's somebody else's success, arriving from a direction nobody, including him, thought to guard against. There's a reading worth offering here, clearly marked as interpretation rather than anything the film states outright. Plan Z works as a kind of pressure release valve for the entire franchise's central joke. The series can only sustain the villain who never wins for so many seasons before some part of the audience starts wondering what would actually happen if he did. The 2004 movie answers that question directly, lets him have the win completely, mind control and rename city and all, and then demonstrates that even total victory doesn't actually change who Plankton is or what he wants next. He's arrested, the world resets, and by the time the next television episode airs, he's back to petty formula heists as though Planktopolis never happened. Having proven it's capable of letting him win, it simply chooses not to do it again for nearly 2 more decades. Whatever this franchise eventually wants to say about Plankton, and we're still a long way from its final word on that question tonight, it apparently isn't "here's what he does" with real power. It's closer to a question about what he does without it. which turns out to be a much stranger and much longer story. Which brings us back to the contradiction sitting right at the start of this video, the one the series has never actually resolved and, as far as the available record shows, has never even tried to. In Plankton, his debut episode back in 1999, that same on-screen readout files him as 1% evil and the rest mere hot air, a diagnostic joke that frames him right from the character's very first appearance as mostly bluster, not a real threat, mostly noise. 26 years later, in his own solo film, the same character stands in front of the people closest to him and declares himself evil from the start. Nobody in either production stops to acknowledge that these two self-descriptions cannot both be true. The franchise simply lets both stand, decades apart, as if the question of what Plankton fundamentally is was never something anyone in the writer's room felt obligated to settle once and for all. It's worth being honest about how unusual that actually is, even by the standards of a show this loosely continuity-bound. Most long-running villains, even comedic ones, get some kind of stable core trait the writing keeps returning to. Plankton doesn't really have that. He gets whichever version of himself a given episode or film needs. Sometimes that's a scheming buffoon undone by his own incompetence. Sometimes, as we just spent a long stretch establishing, it's someone capable of enslaving an entire town under mind control. Sometimes, per Lawrence's own 2009 description, he's a wounded, lonely figure who wants a friend but can't let himself have one. And sometimes, per his own mouth in his own movie, he's simply pure evil, no qualifier attached. The fan community that specifically catalogs and rules on villain archetypes, the Pure Evil Wiki, has actually weighed in on this directly. And their conclusion is worth stating plainly. They've explicitly ruled that mainstream, main continuity Plankton does not qualify for their pure evil classification at all, specifically because of his redeeming traits, his marriage, his moments of vulnerability. They reserve that harsher label only for non-canon spin-off versions of the character, like the one that appears in the crossover game Nicktoons Unite. So even the corner of the internet built specifically to argue about exactly this question has looked at the born pure evil line and, essentially, disagreed with the character's own self-assessment. There's a specific episode that puts this whole unresolved question under a microscope in a way that's easy to miss if you're not looking for it. Plankton's Good Eye, from Season 8, builds an entire plot directly around the same biological trait we spent a good stretch of this video establishing as one of the series' more scientifically grounded design choices, his single eye. Karen explains in the episode that his monocular vision causes real depth perception problems, which she ties directly to a failed safecracking attempt earlier in the plot. Plankton then temporarily grows a second eye using one of SpongeBob's own tears, and along with the new eye, he briefly inherits a version of SpongeBob's relentless optimism as well, seeing the world, for a little while, the way its actual hero does. By the episode's end, he's lost the second eye and reset back to his usual self, the borrowed optimism gone along with it. It's a strange, almost fable-like structure for what's ostensibly a kid's cartoon plot. Give the villain literal access to the hero's outlook on the world, briefly, and then take it away and watch him go right back to being exactly who he was. Read as interpretation. It plays like the writers testing their own contradiction without ever naming it, asking what Plankton would actually be like with a different way of seeing things, and then answering, gently, that it doesn't stick. There's a smaller, sadder through line running underneath all of this that rarely gets brought up outside of dedicated recap communities, and it's worth pulling into the light here because it complicates the pure evil framing more than almost anything else in the series. In the episode New Leaf, Plankton reveals that in the entire history of the Chum Bucket, his only customer, ever, was a rat, and the rat died from eating his food. That's the whole joke, delivered fairly bluntly. Contrast that with Plankton's Regular, from Season 6, which treats a single fish named Nat becoming his first ever repeat customer as a genuine landmark event, significant enough to build an entire episode around. Strip away the comedy for a second, and what's actually being described across these 2 episodes is a small business that has, over the entire run, served essentially nobody, run by a man whose sole documented long-term customer relationship is treated, in universe, as a minor miracle. That's not really the profile of a mastermind, evil or otherwise. It's closer to the profile of someone running a failing shop nobody wants to enter, which sits uncomfortably next to a character who, only a handful of years earlier in the franchise's own internal chronology, briefly conquered an entire town. So which is it? The honest answer, and this is the closest thing to a firm conclusion this particular question is going to get tonight, is that the series has simply never picked one, and probably was never going to. SpongeBob SquarePants is not built the way a serialized drama is built, with a Bible somewhere dictating what Plankton's core nature has to be in every appearance to keep him consistent. It's built the way a long-running gag show is built, where each episode or film gets to reach for whatever version of a character serves that particular joke or that particular emotional beat, and nobody circles back afterward to reconcile it with what came before. Read generously that inconsistency is actually part of what makes Plankton durable across 26 years of material. He's flexible enough to be a buffoon on Tuesday, a conqueror in a 2004 movie, a wounded figure in a 2009 interview, and a self-declared embodiment of pure evil in a 2025 film, without any of those versions technically overriding the others. Read less generously. It just means the writers never actually decided who he is, and every viewer gets to pick whichever Plankton fits the story they personally want to tell about him. Neither reading is wrong. That's sort of the point. For most of this franchise's history, Plankton has effectively had one family member worth talking about, and it wasn't a blood relative at all. It was Karen. That started to change, gradually and then suddenly, as the series got around to actually documenting the rest of his family tree, and it's a lineage that goes back further into print than most casual viewers realize. Plankton's extended family, parents named Ma Plankton and Gordon Plankton, grandparents called Granny Plankton and Granddad Plankton, and a whole scattering of cousins, including one named Clem, was laid out in detail across a comic strip called A Plankton Family Tree, published in SpongeBob Comics issue number 4, well before most of these relatives ever appeared in an actual episode. Several of those cousins do show up on screen collectively, mobbing into frame during Plankton's army, but for a long stretch the family existed mostly as print canon, documented on paper rather than performed on television. That finally changed properly in 2024 with the season 14 episode Blood is Thicker Than Grease, which aired on July 15th of that year, with some fans recalling bits of it circulating online a little earlier, though that detail is hard to confirm. It's a notably significant episode for one specific reason. It marks the first appearance of Plankton's father, Gordon, in the main series proper, rather than in a comic strip or a piece of expanded universe trivia. The premise is almost aggressively simple and, once it lands, a little bit cruel in a way the show plays entirely straight. Plankton's family opens a rival restaurant, the Spud Bucket, directly next door to the Chum Bucket, and this new family business succeeds so completely that it actually puts the Krusty Krab out of business, something 26 years of Plankton's own personal scheming had never once managed to accomplish on its own. The episode's own title card leans into the joke visually, stylized on screen as Blood Eye Dollar Thicker Than Grease, a dollar sign standing in for the S, which tells you plainly what this story is actually about before a single line of dialogue plays. What's notable structurally is just how far the episode pushes its own main character out of the frame to make room for this new material. SpongeBob himself reportedly gets only a handful of lines in the entire episode, an almost unheard of restraint for a show built around him, because that episode isn't really his story at all. It's built entirely around the Plankton family, giving Gordon, in his first appearance, room to actually exist as a character with his own presence, rather than a name mentioned in a comic strip. For a franchise that spent its first 26 years treating Karen as Plankton's only real family relationship worth developing, handing an entire episode over to his actual bloodline, and letting that bloodline succeed where Plankton himself never could, reframes something worth taking seriously. His rivalry with Krabs has always been personal, but it was also, in its own strange way, familiar territory, decades of the same two men locked in the same pattern, his own family showing up and simply outcompeting him at the one thing he spent his entire life failing to do, is a different kind of threat, entirely, and one the show had never actually put on screen before. It's worth being careful about how firmly to plant a flag on some of the wider trivia surrounding this family. 2. Because not everything commonly repeated about Plankton's background holds up under scrutiny. Some fan wikis circulate a specific birth date for the character, commonly given as November 30th, 1942, along with various expansions of what the J in his name is supposed to stand for. That conflicts with what friend or foe implies about him and Krabs being roughly the same age as children, and Krabs himself has been given inconsistent birth dates elsewhere in the show's own history, so any specific Plankton birth date should be treated as disputed trivia rather than settled fact. Similarly, acclaimed hometown of Kensington, Prince Edward Island, with Plankton supposedly relocating to Bikini Bottom as a 6-month-old, shows up on some fan aggregator pages but couldn't be traced back to a clear primary episode source, which puts it in the same low-confidence category. And for what it's worth, no interview or official source turned up anywhere explaining why Hillenburg picked the specific first name Sheldon for this character in the first place. Sometimes a name is just a name, chosen for reasons nobody ever bothered to write down, and the honest thing to do with a gap like that is leave it as a gap rather than filling it with a confident-sounding guess. What that Spud Bucket episode ultimately does, 25 years after the character's debut, is finally give physical, on-screen form to a family that had mostly existed as background trivia and comic strip lore. Gordon Plankton's arrival isn't framed as a warm reunion or a chance for father-son bonding, the kind of sentimental beat you might expect from a legacy character's overdue debut. It's framed as competition, immediate and total, the family succeeding at business the way Plankton himself never has. That choice tells you something about how this franchise tends to handle Plankton's relationships in general. Even the people who share his blood get filtered through the same lens of rivalry and comparison that's defined every other relationship in his life except, as we're about to see, the one with his own wife, which the show was quietly building towards something very different indeed. Before we get to Karen, though, there's a stretch of 2 films, released some years apart from each other and pointed in almost opposite emotional directions, that's worth walking through together, because they show just how far this franchise was willing to bend Plankton's role depending on what a given film actually needed from him. The SpongeBob movie, Sponge Out of Water, hit American theaters on February 6, 2015, directed by Paul Tibbitt in what was his own directorial debut. Made on a budget somewhere between $60 and $74 million, it went on to gross more than $325 million worldwide, making it the 3rd highest grossing Nickelodeon film ever made at the time, and the 5th highest grossing animated film released that year. Those numbers matter here, mainly as context for what the film chose to do with its resources, because Sponge Out of Water hands Plankton his single most explicit turn toward genuine heroism anywhere in the franchise, and it does it by taking the formula out of his hands entirely and putting it in someone else's. The plot centers on a human pirate named Burger Beard, who steals the Krabby Patty formula from both the Krusty Krab and the Chum Bucket simultaneously, which is the detail that makes everything else in the film possible. For once in this franchise's history, Plankton has no formula to chase, because somebody has already taken it away from every party who'd normally be fighting over it. That shared loss forces him and SpongeBob into an uneasy alliance, the two of them working together rather than against each other, culminating in a strange sequence involving time travel and a live-action dolphin wizard named Bubbles who guides them through it. At the film's climax, Plankton temporarily transforms into a giant superhero form the film, and its fandom have nicknamed Plankton. And in that form, he actively helps defeat Burger Beard, rather than simply getting rescued or sidelined. It's worth being clear about what kind of claim this is. The film really does put him in a heroic role, fighting alongside SpongeBob rather than against him, which stands out as a real structural choice rather than a brief gag. Whether that heroism reflects some deeper truth about who Plankton actually is underneath the scheming, or whether it's simply what happens when a story removes his usual obsession and hands him a bigger, shared threat to focus on instead, is a fair question to weigh, and it's one the film itself doesn't really try to answer. It just lets him be the hero for one movie and moves on. There's a piece of scrapped visual development worth mentioning here, because it shows how differently this heroic turn could have looked on screen. Some early concept art reportedly explored a different take on Plankton's mech suit for this film, closer to full Marvel-style powered armor rather than the giant organic-looking form that ultimately made it into the finished movie. It reportedly sat alongside other discarded reimaginings from that same development process, including an alternate redesign for Sandy in a different visual style. None of that concept art made the final cut, but it's a useful reminder that even a film built around a truly new heroic direction for this character went through several visibly different versions of what that heroism was actually going to look like before landing on the one audiences saw. The live-action segments of this film also required solving a problem no earlier SpongeBob production had ever really faced. How do you put a 2-inch, single-eyed cartoon character into a scene with real human actors and a real ocean? Bringing a 2-inch, single-eyed cartoon character into a scene with real human actors and a real ocean reportedly required some physical workarounds on set to get scale, lighting, and shadow right, since no human performer could realistically double for his proportions in a live shot. Physical reference models were reportedly built from the digital character sculpts as well, giving the on-set crew something tangible to reference, even though the character himself would be added digitally afterward. It's a small, very practical production detail, but it captures something true about this character generally, even behind the scenes. Getting Plankton to convincingly share a frame with anyone else has always required some kind of workaround, whether that's animators enlarging him past his intended microscopic scale decades earlier, or a visual effects team building a plywood cutout just to get the lighting right. Whatever goodwill Sponge Out of Water built up for Plankton didn't carry forward into the next film. The SpongeBob movie, Sponge on the Run, directed by Tim Hill, had a considerably rockier path to audiences than its predecessor. It released in Canada and at drive-in theaters on August 14, 2020, internationally on November 5th that same year, and finally in the United States on March 4, 2021, where it bypassed theaters entirely and went straight to Paramount Plus for streaming. That release pattern wasn't a creative decision. It was a direct consequence of the COVID-19 pandemic reshaping the entire theatrical distribution landscape in real time, and the film's box office numbers reflect that disruption starkly. Against a budget of roughly $60 million, Sponge on the Run earned only about $4.8 million theatrically. That's not a reflection of quality or of audience interest in the story itself. It's close to a textbook case of a film simply being released at the worst possible moment in modern box office history, rerouted around the exact distribution channel it was built for. Inside the story itself, Plankton reverts fully to his more familiar scheming role, with no trace of the heroism Sponge Out of Water had briefly given him. Rather than teaming up with anyone, he kidnaps SpongeBob's pet snail Gary and hands him over to a larger antagonist, King Poseidon, using the snail as leverage specifically to lure SpongeBob away so he can steal the formula uninterrupted. It's a colder move than most of what we've covered tonight, using a beloved pet as a bargaining chip against the franchise's own hero rather than simply competing for a recipe. Read side by side, these two films tell you plainly that this character has no fixed trajectory, the way a more serialized story might insist on. He doesn't steadily grow more heroic across the decade, separating these releases, the way a character arc in a different kind of franchise might be expected to. He's simply whatever a given film needs him to be, hero when the plot removes his obsession and gives him someone bigger to fight, villain again the moment that obsession is back on the table. Several years and a wide swing in box office fortunes separate these two versions of the same character, and neither one erases the other. They just sit there, side by side, both equally canon, both equally true. Plankton's reach has never actually stayed confined to the flagship show and its 4 theatrical films, either, and this is the part of his history that tends to get skipped entirely in longer retrospectives, because most of it happened somewhere a typical rewatch would never think to look. Spread across games, a stage musical, a live-action sitcom cameo, and a handful of spin-off shows, there's an entire secondary lore trail running parallel to everything we've already covered tonight. Start with the games, because there are more of them, and stranger ones than most viewers would guess. Beyond Battle for Bikini Bottom and its forgotten Switch robot uprising, which we covered earlier, the 2013 tie entitled SpongeBob SquarePants, Plankton's robotic revenge builds an entire game-exclusive expansion of his family, introducing bosses named Rainchild and Clem, each one piloting their own individual giant battle robot suit, characters who exist nowhere in the actual show or comics. The game's ending lands on a particularly cruel little joke after the entire playthrough is spent trying to crack open a safe to finally steal the formula. The safe turns out to contain nothing but a note revealing that the real formula was sitting in Mr. Krabs' pocket the whole time. Every hour spent on that safe, in other words, was wasted before the player even started. Plankton and Karen also show up as playable, team-up characters well outside their own franchise's borders, fighting alongside SpongeBob and the rest of the cast against a shared villain named Globulus in SpongeBob SquarePants, featuring Nicktoons' Globs of Doom, and appearing again in the broader Nickelodeon crossover title Nicktoons Unite, released back in 2005. There's a fighting game footnote here too, one that's almost funny given everything we've established about this character's actual scale. Plankton was left out of the original Nickelodeon All-Star Brawl, released in 2021, though data mined files from that game reportedly contained placeholder announcer voice lines referencing him, suggesting he'd been considered for the roster and cut before launch, rather than simply never discussed at all. He finally became playable in the 2023 sequel, Nickelodeon All-Star Brawl 2, piloting a battlesuit the game calls Mecha Plankton, visually built on the same mech design established in Sponge Out of Water. The irony writes itself, a character defined, biologically and comedically, by being one of the smallest things in the entire cast, finally gets his shot at a fighting game roster by climbing inside a suit that ranks him among the physically largest fighters standing on the stage. Off the screen entirely, Plankton and Karen made it to Broadway. The stage musical SpongeBob SquarePants opened on December 4th, 2017, following an earlier pre-Broadway premiere in Chicago in 2016, where Nick Blemire originated the role. Wesley Taylor went on to play Plankton for the Broadway production itself. On stage, the pair try to exploit a town-wide volcano panic, reportedly rigging up some kind of device to herd Bikini Bottom citizens into a captive evacuation pod they can then presumably control. The plan collapses in a way that's very much in keeping with everything we've already seen from this character. The two of them get so caught up arguing with each other mid-scheme that they accidentally blurt the entire plot out loud in front of the crowd they were trying to fool. Even given a live stage and a completely different medium, the writers landed on the same basic joke that's carried this character since 1999. A plan undone, not by a clever hero, but by his own inability to keep his mouth shut at the wrong moment. Print has its own dedicated Plankton milestone worth naming. SpongeBob Comics issue number 14, titled simply Plankton Comics and released on November 14, 2012, was the first comic issue built entirely around the character. Stephen Hillenburg himself contributed a painted phytoplankton poster specifically for that issue, a small but genuine piece of the creator's own artwork attached directly to the character he originally sketched as a minor villain in a mid-90s pitch Bible and very nearly left there. Then there's the stranger territory, crossovers that have nothing to do with SpongeBob's own world at all. In the Nickelodeon sitcom Victorious, the episode Tori Goes Platinum from 2012 features paparazzi mistaking a recurring teacher character named Sikowitz for Doug Lawrence, Plankton's real-world voice actor, and rather than correcting them, Sikowitz plays along, ad-libbing a joke that references Karen and the secret Krabby Patty formula directly. It's a strange little wink, a live-action teen sitcom acknowledging, in character, the existence of the actor behind a completely different animated villain, treating Lawrence's association with the role as famous enough to be a punchline entirely outside its own franchise. International dubbing turns up one more piece of trivia worth flagging carefully, because it's reported through fan forums rather than any official Nickelodeon statement, and should be treated accordingly. According to fan-sourced discussion referenced against Encyclopedia SpongeBobia's own character pages, Plankton is voiced by a female performer in the Japanese dub of the show, which fan commentary attributes to a broader convention in Japanese dubbing of casting higher-pitched voices for small or diminutive characters generally. The reported exception is the first SpongeBob movie back in 2004, where he was apparently voiced by a man in that same dub. That's an interesting wrinkle in how this character translates across markets, but it's worth being upfront that it rests on forum-level sourcing rather than a confirmed cast list, so it belongs here as reported trivia rather than settled fact. Two spin-off shows round this out. Camp Coral, SpongeBob's Under Years, which we touched on earlier for its second, separate proto-Krabby Patty origin beat, reimagines Plankton and Karen's entire day job, running a secret lab hidden beneath a summer camp kitchen rather than a restaurant across from the Krusty Krab. And in the Patrick Star Show, the Season 4 episode, It's Too Late. With Plankton, which aired on October 10, 2025, Plankton gets to host an entire parody late-night talk show for shipwrecked visitors, complete with a title card spoofing The Tonight Show starring Jimmy Fallon, and a Johnny Carson-style fake golf swing during the opening. It ends, in keeping with the character's whole track record, with him accidentally setting himself on fire using a magnifying glass. 26 years after a diagnostic readout pegged him as barely a threat at all, the franchise is still, quite literally in this case, willing to let him go up in flames for a joke. All of that adds up to a character whose footprint is considerably larger than the chum bucket he can never quite get off the ground. Games, a Broadway stage, a live-action sitcom cameo referencing his actual voice actor by association, international dubs recasting his gender entirely, spin-off shows reinventing his day job twice over. None of it changes who he fundamentally is within any single one of those stories, but taken together, it's a reminder that this 2-inch copepod with the borrowed hero's voice has had an enormous life outside the show most people think they already know completely. Which finally brings us to the biggest single swing this franchise has taken on this character in its entire history. And it didn't start as the thing you've probably seen. Long before Plankton the movie existed as a feature film, it existed as a much smaller idea sitting in Doug Lawrence's head. And the story of how it grew from that smaller idea into a global Netflix release is, on its own, one of the more interesting production stories in this whole franchise. According to interviews given around the film's release, Lawrence had been carrying the core premise for years before it ever became a movie, something closer to half a decade by his own account. He originally pictured it not as a feature at all, but as a 22-minute television special tentatively called Karen Takes Over. That's worth sitting with for a moment. The entire idea that eventually became a global streaming release, an idea big enough to finally make Karen the antagonist of her own story after 26 years as Plankton's sidekick, started life as something small enough to fit into a single half-hour broadcast slot. According to Wikipedia's production history entry on the characters, no separate ongoing Plankton and Karen series was ever actually announced alongside this. The persistent rumor of a full spin-off show appears to be fans conflating this earlier special concept with something bigger than it ever was. It grew, eventually, into something too large for either format, as director Dave Needham put it directly in an interview with Animation Scoop. It goes back to Doug. This is his story. The story he's wanted to tell for, I think, 20 years. Needham's own summary of what actually happens to Karen across the film is blunt in a way that's worth quoting directly, because it strips away any sense that this was a purely comedic pivot dreamed up for a marketing hook. She's waited 25 years supporting Plankton, and she finally snaps. She's had enough. That's not a joke pitch. That's a description of a character finally reaching a breaking point after 26 years of being, in universe, the more competent, more patient half of a marriage that mostly got played for laughs at her expense. Lawrence has said that the production team went back and rewatched large stretches of the show's earliest seasons specifically to make sure they weren't leaving anything unaddressed. In his words, making sure there weren't stones left unturned, a level of continuity care this franchise doesn't always extend to itself, as we've already seen plainly in the contradictions this video has spent time on. Tonight, producer Mark Ceccarelli, one of the show's current executive producers and showrunners, has pointed to a specific structural choice in the film as genuinely unusual for a story built around its own title character. As he put it, how often do you have a movie with a star where he sings an entire song about what a total jerk he is? That's Plankton's own solo villain song, a number built entirely around him cataloging his own worst qualities, sung by the character the film is nominally centered on, in his own voice, without any hero standing off to the side correcting him. Lawrence, in that same conversation, offered a rare moment of completely sincere character analysis. Dropping the joke framing entirely, there's a little part of Plankton in all of us, a very small and angry part, but it's there. It's a strange thing to hear from the person who spent 26 years making this specific character scream and scheme and lose, but it lines up cleanly with the reading Lawrence was already offering back in that 2009 New Zealand interview. The wounded character looking for a friend framing that predates any of this film's marketing by a decade and a half. Some of what didn't make it into the finished film is worth naming too, because it shows just how much bigger this story briefly threatened to become before the filmmakers pulled it back down to something more grounded. Visual development artist Natalie Francione-Karp produced concept art, according to reporting in Animation Magazine, depicting what's described as a colossal, monolith-scale version of Karen that had literally overtaken Bikini Bottom, a far more apocalyptic vision of her villain turn than anything that ended up on screen. The filmmakers scaled that back deliberately, choosing to keep the story's emotional center on a strained marriage rather than a city-leveling threat, which tells you something about where this team's actual priorities landed once they had a whole feature film's worth of runway to work with. It would have been easy to make Karen a giant monster. They chose, instead, to make her a wife who finally stopped tolerating being underestimated. One more piece of context worth including here, treated carefully because the underlying quotes reach us secondhand through coverage of a paywalled original interview rather than a primary source directly. Ceccarelli and Needham have reportedly described the film's development as unexpectedly turning into a great musical project, an up-close, personal look specifically at Plankton and Karen's relationship rather than a broader ensemble adventure. That framing is worth flagging as reported rather than independently verified in full, but it lines up with everything else on the record here. A production team that kept narrowing its focus, again and again, from a monolithic city eating threat down to a 22-minute special down to, finally, a feature film built around one specific marriage under real strain. There's a documentation trail worth mentioning that speaks to how seriously this whole corner of the franchise is now being treated by the people who make it. A new official art book, SpongeBob SquarePants, The Art of an Undersea World by Tracy Miller Zarnecki, published through IDU in 2025, is the first SpongeBob art book to cover the franchise's films and spin-offs all the way through Plankton, the movie. It carries a foreword from current showrunner Mark Ceccarelli, an introduction from original story editor Derek Dryman, and an afterword from Tom Kenny himself, SpongeBob's own voice actor, bookending a print history that 26 years earlier very nearly didn't include Plankton as anything more than a background nuisance at all. So that's how we got here. A half-hour special idea Lawrence carried around for close to 2 decades. A discarded vision of a giant city swallowing Karen. A production team that deliberately chose intimacy over spectacle. And an art book now sitting on shelves that treats this whole saga as worth documenting properly for the first time. What actually happens once the cameras, so to speak, start rolling is where this gets strange and moving, and it's where this whole video has been heading from the very first line. Plankton, the movie, was announced publicly in June of 2024, reported by Deadline, and it premiered globally on Netflix on March 7th, 2025. It was directed by Dave Needham, and it was co-written by Plankton's own voice actor, Doug Lawrence, alongside Kaz and Chris Viscardi, which means the man who has spent 26 years performing this character also had a direct hand in writing the story that finally reckons with who that character actually is. That's not a small detail. Most franchise villains never get a writer's room seat reserved specifically for the actor who plays them, let alone one who's held that seat for the character's entire existence. The plot itself starts from a premise that lands harder the longer you sit with it. Karen, after 26 years of being consistently dismissed, talked over, and treated as background support for a husband whose schemes never work, makes a specific, deliberate choice. She removes her own empathy chip. It isn't damaged, and nothing in the film suggests she was sabotaged or manipulated into it by some outside villain, the way a lesser story might have framed it. She takes it out herself, on purpose. What emerges once that chip is gone is a side of Karen the show had never shown before, a hidden capacity for building an actual mech suit and a fortress, and with that capability in hand, she sets out to take over the world in a way Plankton himself, across 26 years and an entire alphabet of failed plans, never once managed to pull off. For the very first time, the antagonist standing between Plankton and a happy ending isn't Mr. Krabs, it isn't SpongeBob. It's his own wife, and it's a menace built entirely out of feeling perpetually unseen rather than out of any programmed evil at all. That forces an alliance nobody watching this franchise for 26 years would have predicted. Plankton teams up with SpongeBob, with Patrick, and, in the sharpest structural twist of all, with Mr. Krabs himself, his oldest enemy, and the other half of the origin story we covered earlier tonight, all of them working together to stop Karen. Think about what that actually does to the shape of this character's entire mythology. The rivalry that began with 2 childhood friends fighting over a pot of accidentally combined ingredients. The rivalry that's carried this franchise's central joke for 26 years gets set aside entirely, because the actual threat this time is closer to home than either of them. It bears saying what kind of claim this is. The film does resolve with Krabs and Plankton on the same side, which is new, but nothing about it undoes or erases the friend or foe history between them. It simply proves that history was never actually the biggest thing either of them was capable of facing. The ending is where this whole story lands its real emotional weight, and it's worth walking through carefully rather than summarizing in a single line, because it's genuinely one of the more thoughtful pieces of writing this franchise has produced. Karen's empathy chip, the one she removed herself at the start of the film, ends up burnt out by the story's climax. Rather than simply discarding it or treating it as scrap, Plankton's allies implant that same burnt-out chip into Plankton himself, giving him direct access to what Karen actually felt. All of it. The full weight of 26 years of being dismissed. He doesn't win her back with a scheme. After an entire career built on schemes, plans lettered from A through Z, and then numbered past that. This is the one moment where a scheme is explicitly not the answer. Instead, he rejects the secret formula outright, the object that's defined his entire adult life and his entire rivalry with Krabs, and tells Karen directly that she herself is the one true formula he actually needs. The two of them reconcile, and in a detail that keeps this from tipping over into something too neatly redemptive for a comedy about a 2-inch copepod. The film doesn't end with either of them reformed. It ends with the two of them going right back to scheming together, side by side, the way they always have, just with something real settled between them that wasn't settled before. There's an interpretation worth offering plainly here, because it's the thing this whole video has been circling since that very first contradiction in the cold open. Everything we've covered tonight, the readout that first sized him up as mostly harmless, the movie where he calls himself evil to the core, the wounded and lonely Red Lawrence was already giving reporters back in 2009, the biological accuracy sitting underneath his most cartoonish design choice, mostly unremarked on, the family that finally showed up only to outcompete him at the one thing he's never managed himself. All of it gets a kind of answer here, not by resolving the contradiction, but by making the contradiction the actual point. Plankton was never going to be cleanly evil or cleanly sympathetic, because the show was never actually building toward a verdict on that question. It was building toward this, a small, angry, frequently ridiculous creature finally handed the full weight of what his own neglect cost the one person who stuck with him anyway, and choosing, for once, not to scheme his way out of it. Reception backs up just how well this landed, and it's worth stating plainly that a direct-to-streaming spin-off built around a comic villain is historically one of the riskiest formats a franchise can attempt. Several outlets, including Collider and Outlook India, described the film as a genuine pleasant surprise, with some coverage placing it above the prior year's theatrical release in overall critical reception, a notably strong result for a film that skipped theaters entirely. Some fans have gone further still, naming Plankton, the movie, the best entry in the franchise since the original 2004 film, more than 2 decades earlier, a striking claim for a spin-off nobody was guaranteed to take seriously going in. As of this research, no sequel to Plankton, the movie, has been announced anywhere, and any claim of one already being in development should be treated as unconfirmed rumor rather than fact, at least for now. What this film ultimately does, structurally, is something this franchise had never attempted before across 26 years and 3 earlier feature films. Every prior movie built its conflict around an outside threat, a pirate stealing a formula, a sea god weaponizing a pet snail, a crown theft engineered to clear the field for a hostile takeover. Plankton, the movie, is the first time the threat comes from inside the marriage it spent a full 25 years treating as comic furniture, a wall-mounted computer built out of a potato and a calculator, upgraded quietly year after year until nobody was really watching closely enough to notice just how much capability and just how much unaddressed resentment had been sitting inside that chassis the entire time. Karen was never simply Plankton's sidekick, not really, not even in the earliest seasons where the show treated her that way. She was always capable of more than the joke let on. It just took 26 years, one burnt-out chip, and one very patient wife finally reaching her limit for the show to actually say so out loud. Step back from any single episode or film, and the numbers around this character start telling their own strange story. One that's worth spending a little time on before we close things out, because it's a good demonstration of exactly how much even the people cataloging this show can't quite agree on. Start with something Nickelodeon itself put out, which is rarer than you'd think for a franchise this large. During the network's 2022 NFL Wildcard broadcast, a graphic reportedly aired giving height and weight figures for several main characters putting SpongeBob at around 4 inches and 1 ounce, Patrick at around 5 inches and 2 ounces, and Plankton at around 2 inches and 1 milligram. That's an unusual thing for Nickelodeon to publish, exact numeric stats for characters that are almost always left to visual scale and context clues rather than a stated figure. But it's worth flagging the obvious tension sitting right inside that graphic. 2 inches is noticeably larger than how Plankton is actually drawn relative to everyone around him on screen, where he's routinely visualized as small enough to nearly disappear next to something as ordinary as a spatula or a coffee mug. It's a small, telling inconsistency between the network's own official marketing copy and the show's actual, moment-to-moment visual proportions. And it's the sort of thing that only surfaces when you put a broadcast graphic and an actual frame of animation side by side, which almost nobody ever does. The show's total size is similarly resistant to a clean number. As of research for this video, in mid-2026, SpongeBob SquarePants is in the middle of its 17th season, which itself premiered back on June 12th of that year, and a 19th season had already been announced only days before that, on June 9th. Episode count aggregators disagree with each other on the precise running total for the series overall, with figures like 656 circulating alongside other tallies, depending entirely on how individual outlets choose to count shorts, segments, and specials within a single broadcast slot. The honest way to describe that number is roughly several hundred episodes, not a single confirmed figure, and treating any more precise claim as settled would be exactly the kind of overconfident guess this video has been trying to avoid all the way through. Plankton's own presence within that sprawling total is just as loosely tracked. According to tally pages maintained by the fan site Spongepedia, and this figure comes with the same caveat, fan compiled rather than officially confirmed, Plankton appears in some form, whether a full role, a brief cameo, a voice-only appearance, or even just a title card, in roughly 159 main series episodes. That's a large footprint for a character who started out demoted to minor, occasional status during the show's very first season, but it's worth treating as a reported estimate rather than a hard confirmed number, the same way the show's total episode count resists a single clean figure. There's one number, though, that keeps circulating with real confidence and simply doesn't hold up under any of the research behind this video: the claim that Plankton has attempted to steal the Krabby Patty formula something like 2 million times. It's the kind of statistic that sounds specific enough to be real and gets repeated in exactly that confident tone across fan discussion. But no primary episode, no official Nickelodeon source, nothing traceable actually backs that figure up. It may be a misremembering pulled in from some other piece of media entirely, or simply a number someone made up once that stuck because it was funny and vaguely plausible. The honest framing, and the one this video is going to stick with, is that Plankton has run dozens of documented schemes across more than 25 years on screen, not a single precise total anyone can actually point to. One franchise-wide record does hold up cleanly, though, and it's worth putting on the record because it's an accurate way to close out this character's relationship to the film specifically. Plankton is the only villain confirmed to appear in every SpongeBob theatrical film released so far. The 2004 original, Sponge Out of Water in 2015, Sponge on the Run in 2020, and, by direct extension, his own 2025 solo film. It's worth being precise about what that record actually means, though. Rather than letting it sound bigger than it is, he's squarely the primary antagonist in only one of those 4 appearances, the original film, since his own movie hands that role to Karen instead. In the other 3, he shares the antagonist role with, or cedes it entirely to, someone else: Burger Beard in one case, King Poseidon in another, and his own wife Karen in the third. Still, 4 for 4 is 4 for 4. Man Ray can't claim that. Neither can the Flying Dutchman or anyone else who's rotated through this show's long cast of antagonists over 26 years. Plankton, quite remarkably, is the only one with a perfect attendance record. And there's one very small, very specific piece of trivia worth closing this chapter on, because it's the kind of thing that reveals how much of what fans remember about a long-running show is actually collective invention rather than anything the show itself ever said. The recurring image of Mr. Krabs physically ejecting Plankton from the Krusty Krab, spun out on a plate, launched bodily through the door, is a real, well-documented visual gag that recurs across a large number of episodes. But the specific line so many fans associate with that moment, Plankton's snarling "I'll get you next time" as he's thrown out, was not found verbatim in any transcript checked for this video. It's very likely fan paraphrase or a half-remembered meme rather than an actual recurring line of dialogue the show ever wrote. It's a small thing, a single misattributed catchphrase, but it's a useful closing reminder of exactly how these deep dive videos have to work. Check the thing you're sure you remember, because sometimes the thing you're sure you remember never actually happened the way you remember it. There's one more thread worth pulling before we close this out, and it loops all the way back to where this video began, because the reason any of tonight's material exists at all comes down to one person having held on to this character, in every sense, for 26 consecutive years. Doug Lawrence isn't simply an employee reading lines someone hands him. He's described, in his own words, the specific leverage that comes from being both the writer and the performer at once. "I always have a say in it, because I play him." Hey, that doesn't sound like how he'd say it. That's not a small thing to be able to say about a character this enduring. Most voice actors, however beloved their performance becomes, have no formal claim on how a character is written, no seat at the table when a script decides what that character believes or wants in a given episode. Lawrence has had exactly that seat for the entire run of this show, which means every version of Plankton this video has walked through tonight. The scheming buffoon, the world conqueror, the wounded figure from that 2009 interview, the self-declared embodiment of pure evil, the reconciled husband at the end of his own film, passed through the judgment of the one person who's had to actually become him, out loud, over and over, for 26 years. He's described voicing the character's rage as personally cathartic, a way of channeling something real through a 2-inch cartoon villain screaming about a stolen recipe. That length of tenure raises its own quiet question, one the show has never had any reason to answer directly, but that sits underneath everything covered tonight anyway. What does it actually cost a person to keep returning to the same voice, the same rage, the same repeated defeat, for more than 25 years running? Lawrence has never framed it as a burden in anything on the record here. If anything, everything he said points the other direction, toward genuine investment, toward a character he pushed to keep alive back when the writer's room was ready to let him fade into the background, toward a story he apparently carried around in some form for nearly 20 years before it finally became a movie, built specifically to give his character's marriage the weight it had never been given before. That's a strange kind of loyalty to have toward a role that on the page is mostly built to lose. It's worth circling back to a design idea that never made it past the earliest planning stages, because it's a nice bookend to the biological accuracy this video spent real time on earlier. Alongside the driver's license sketches and the human-esque early face we already covered, Hillenburg's original design process reportedly included concept work showing Plankton housed inside a full robotic exosuit, with Karen's entire computer system built directly into the suit itself, fused together as a single unit rather than existing as two separate characters living across the street from Krabs and Company. That version never made it to air. What the show settled on instead kept Plankton and Karen as two distinct entities, a tiny organism and a machine that started life as a potato with a calculator strapped to it, each with their own separate existence, their own separate voice actor, their own separate arc that eventually, 26 years later, gets to collide directly in a film built entirely around what happens when one of them finally stops being treated as an accessory to the other. It's a small, discarded design idea, but it's worth naming here precisely because the version the show didn't use would have made Plankton, the movie, structurally impossible. You can't tell a story about a wife finally asserting her own independence from a marriage if that wife was designed, from the very beginning, as a literal extension of her husband's own equipment. One last piece of trivia is worth including here, mostly because it's a rare case of something holding up cleanly rather than collapsing under scrutiny the way so much of this character's surrounding folklore does. Across several of the show's major international dubs, French, German, Italian, and Latin American Spanish among them, the character's name stays largely intact, rendered as Plankton, or occasionally Plankton, without the kind of joke-altering translation choices that sometimes reshape a character's dialogue entirely for a different market. No confirmed reports turned up of any market specifically reworking Plankton's jokes or characterization in a way that meaningfully changes who he is. That should be read carefully, as an absence of evidence rather than confirmed proof that nothing was ever changed anywhere. But it's a small, steady thread running underneath everything else covered tonight. However differently this character gets read, sympathetic villain or pure evil, wounded outcast or world conqueror, hero for one film or schemer again, the moment the plot allows it. The name stays the same everywhere he goes. Before we close, there's a question a video with a title like this one really ought to answer directly. How much of Plankton's story actually ran into real trouble with censors and broadcasters? And how much of that reputation is just internet noise repeated so often it started to feel like fact? The honest record here is fairly modest, and it's better to say so than to inflate it for the sake of a bigger claim. One specific line from Plankton's debut episode, "Come back here, you swine," is reported by fan and wiki censorship compilations, rather than any official Nickelodeon statement, to have been cut or altered in some international broadcasts, on the reasoning that swine reads as a considerably harsher insult in certain markets than it does in English. That's worth including here with the appropriate caveat. It's moderately sourced trivia, not a primary confirmed fact. The sort of claim that shows up reliably across fan-run compilation videos, but doesn't trace back to a documented network memo anyone's been able to produce. Take it as plausible, not certain. What's actually notable, though, is what didn't happen, because it's the opposite of what the framing around this character sometimes implies. No confirmed case turned up anywhere, across the research behind this video, of an entire Plankton-centric episode being pulled from broadcast outright, in any country, for any reason. That puts him in a meaningfully different category from another episode this channel has covered before, Nasty Patty, which was in fact officially banned in specific markets, pulled from the Hebrew language dub in Israel, and pulled from broadcast entirely on EBS in South Korea, both times because it was judged too frightening for its intended audience. That's a real, confirmed, full episode ban, on the record, for a different piece of this show entirely. Plankton's own content, by contrast, has only ever drawn the kind of line-level, scene-level edits that plenty of children's animation absorbs routinely without anyone remembering it decades later. For a character, this title calls insane. It's a useful corrective. Whatever's actually wild about this character's 26-year history, it was never actually his content getting broadcasters nervous enough to pull him off the air. That changes the shape of this whole video's framing considerably, because it reframes what insane actually means across everything this video has covered tonight. It was never about shock value, never about a character too dark or too frightening for the network carrying him. The insane part, if there's an honest version of that word to apply here, is structural. It's a villain who was nearly written out of his own show in its first season and ended up carrying it for 26 years instead. It's a marriage that started as a joke about a wall-mounted computer built from a potato and gradually became the emotional center of the newest chapter in the entire franchise. It's a rivalry that started with two frightened kids hiding from bullies side by side, and somehow, decades later, still hasn't fully worked itself out. Nothing about any of that needed a banned episode to be remarkable. It was strange enough on its own. It's worth going back one more time to that original 1990s pitch document, because there's a piece of its intent that's easy to skip past in favor of the funnier details: the mocked-up driver's license, the limousine submarine hybrid. The human-esque face nothing like the character audiences eventually got. What's actually confirmed about that early planning stage, and it's worth being careful to state only what's confirmed here rather than reaching for something more dramatic sounding, is that Hillenburg conceived Plankton specifically as Mr. Krabs' narrative foil from the very start. Not a general-purpose villain who happened to end up paired against a crab who ran a restaurant, but a character built, structurally, from the beginning, to exist in opposition to one specific other character. Some corners of fan discussion like to describe that early design as drawing on James Bond villain archetypes, or on film noir conventions, and it's worth being direct about this. No interview or documented source confirms either of those as an actual stated influence. They're the kind of plausible-sounding claim that spreads, because it fits the character's silhouette, a tiny, scheming figure in an industrial setting, without ever actually being something Hillenburg or the writer's room is on record saying. What is confirmed is narrower and, honestly, more useful. Plankton was built to be Krabs' opposite number from the start. Years before Friend or Foe finally explained why that opposition ran as deep as a shared childhood. That intention shows up in smaller, quieter ways across the writer's room's history too, not just in the character's original conception. In an interview reportedly given around New York Comic Con, Vincent Waller, who alongside Mark Ceccarelli has served as one of the show's executive producers and showrunners for a large stretch of its later run, is said to have been asked to name some of his own personal favorite episodes from after the show's 10th season. By some accounts, he named Plankton Paranoia among them. It's a small piece of trivia, easy to miss inside a longer interview about 2 decades of the show's history. But it's worth including here precisely because it comes from someone actually steering the show's direction, rather than from fan consensus or a ranked list assembled after the fact. When the person actually running the writer's room picks out a Plankton episode by name as a personal favorite, years after the character could have simply coasted on repetition, it says something about how much this specific corner of the show still mattered to the people making it, long after the initial novelty of a tiny villain with a big voice had worn off. There's a broader pattern worth naming here too, one that isn't about Plankton directly, but that explains a great deal about how a show this absurd keeps landing genuine emotional beats inside its comedy. The landmark early episode, Rock Bottom, co-written by Lawrence and developed in the writer's room alongside Derek Dryman and Hillenburg himself, wasn't built from a random premise pulled out of thin air. According to interviews Lawrence has given, it was mined directly from his own childhood, a specific memory of getting on the wrong school bus in 1st grade and panicking among total strangers, reshaped into a piece of surreal, unsettling comedy about SpongeBob getting stranded somewhere unfamiliar as night falls. That's not a Plankton episode, but it's the same writer's room, working the same way, turning something small and personal into something strange and funny, and, underneath the strangeness, genuinely true. It's the same method, structurally, that let Lawrence eventually turn a wounded character who is really looking for a friend into an actual on-screen relationship a decade and a half after he first described Plankton that way to a regional interviewer nobody outside the fandom was likely to be reading. The show's best material, Plankton included, keeps tracing back to the same source. Somebody in that room deciding a real feeling was worth smuggling into a cartoon about a sponge, a crab, and a copepod who never quite got what he wanted. There's a particular kind of scale worth naming as we head toward the end of this one, because it's been sitting underneath every single chapter tonight without ever quite being named outright. This is, canonically, one of the smallest characters in the entire show, a 2-inch, 1 milligram copepod who was originally meant to be drawn so small he'd barely register on screen at all. And somehow that same impossibly small creature has accumulated one of the largest, most sprawling footprints of anyone in this franchise. A role in every theatrical film, a stage musical on Broadway, a Netflix movie centered on his crumbling marriage, a dedicated comic issue with a painted contribution from the show's own creator, a fighting game mech suit that ranks him among the physically biggest characters in that entire roster, despite being, in his own show, one of the smallest things swimming around Bikini Bottom. Almost nothing about Plankton's actual size explains the size of what he's taken up in this franchise's history. That gap between how small he's drawn and how much room he's actually occupied across 26 years of material might be the single strangest thing about him. Stranger even than the eye that happens to match real copepod anatomy. Stranger than a wife built out of a potato who eventually gets to be the villain of her own movie. It's worth remembering, closing this out, that Stephen Hillenburg, the man who sketched that first unrecognizable version of Plankton onto a mock driver's license 3 decades ago, passed away in 2018. He didn't live to see the Spud Bucket episode finally put Plankton's father on screen, didn't live to see Karen get her own movie, didn't live to see a full official art book built around a franchise that, by that point, had grown so far past its original pitch Bible that the character he'd once demoted to a minor role during the first season had become the subject of a feature film about that very marriage coming apart. Everything covered tonight past 2018 happened without the person who first drew this creature onto a page. The show, and the character, kept going anyway, carried forward by a writer's room and by one actor who never stopped arguing that this particular loser was worth taking seriously. So that's Plankton, or as much of him as 26 years of episodes, 3 feature films, 1 solo movie, a Broadway stage, a stack of comics, and a handful of stray video games and sitcom cameos actually add up to. It's a strange thing, spending this much time with a character like this, because he was never supposed to be the one carrying any of it. He was meant to show up once or twice, lose, and disappear. A minor irritant in a show that already had Squidward's misery and Krabs' greed to run on without him. Instead, he became the one constant the show kept circling back to for 26 years, through petty formula heists and a genuine, if temporary, conquest of an entire town, through a family that finally arrived only to beat him at his own game, through a wife who spent 26 years being underestimated before the franchise finally let her stop being quite so patient. There's something worth saying plainly about why a show this silly keeps generating this much material for people to pick apart late at night. SpongeBob SquarePants was never built to reward this kind of close attention. It's broad, it's absurd, it exists to make kids laugh at a sponge who lives in a pineapple and works for minimum wage flipping patties for a boss who loves money more than almost anything else. And yet, underneath that surface, there's Karen, named after a real woman who couldn't finish her own audition. There's a design accident that happened to land on real marine biology. There's a rivalry born from 2 lonely children who once fled the same bullies. None of that was strictly necessary for the show to work as a cartoon. It's there anyway, because somebody in that writer's room, across nearly 3 decades of scripts, kept choosing to put something true underneath the joke rather than leaving the joke on its own. Plankton's story, in the end, isn't really a villain's story at all. Not in the way you'd expect from a character who spends most of his screen time scheming and losing and screaming about a secret recipe he's never quite going to get. It's closer to a story about being underestimated, about getting demoted before you've even had a chance to prove anything, and somehow staying around long enough to be handed, eventually, an entire film built around what it actually costs the people close to you when nobody's paying attention to what they're carrying. He never really wins. He's not supposed to. But 26 years on, he's still down there, running a restaurant nobody eats at, married to a computer who finally got to be more than a punchline, waiting for whatever comes next. It's worth remembering, too, how much of what we covered tonight only exists because somebody kept insisting on it against the show's own instincts. A network that, by some accounts, wanted a celebrity for a one-off role. A writer's room that had already decided this character was minor. A voice that was supposed to belong to somebody else entirely. None of what makes Plankton worth an entire video like this one was guaranteed. It got argued into existence, scene by scene, contract by contract, interview by interview, by people who apparently saw something in a tiny, angry, mostly unsuccessful villain that the original plan never accounted for. That's a strange thing to think about at this hour. A cartoon copepod owing his entire 26-year existence to a handful of people simply refusing to let him fade into the background the way he was originally meant to. Most characters don't get that kind of advocacy. This one did, repeatedly, from the very first season all the way through to a Netflix movie built around the one relationship the show had spent decades treating as furniture. And that's really where this whole story leaves you if you dwell on it long enough. Not with a villain finally defeated or a hero finally triumphant, because that was never actually the shape of what's been happening here. It's a much slower thing than that. A character built to lose who somehow never stopped being worth writing another chapter for. A wife built to be background who turned out to have an entire unaddressed self sitting quietly inside her the whole time. A rivalry born between two frightened kids that still, 26 years and 4 films later, hasn't entirely worked itself out. Bikini Bottom keeps going. The Krusty Krab keeps outselling the Chum Bucket. And somewhere across the street, a 2-inch copepod is almost certainly drawing up another plan that isn't going to work. Because that's who he's always been. And, if this franchise has anything to say about it, who he's probably always going to stay. That, more than any single scheme or any single reconciliation, might be the actual shape of this character's appeal after 26 years. He doesn't get to change permanently. He doesn't get a final tidy arc where the losing stops for good and he settles into some new, wiser version of himself. Even after the movie, even after Karen, even after everything this video has spent hours walking through tonight, the show still needs him back at the Chum Bucket next week, plotting something new, losing to it all over again. There's a kind of comfort hidden inside that repetition, if you let yourself settle into it, rather than expecting a character to grow the way people sometimes do. Some stories are about change. This one, underneath all the schemes and the family and the marriage finally being taken seriously, is mostly about somebody who keeps showing up anyway. If you're still with me at this point, thank you for spending this much quiet, late-night time with a 2-inch copepod and everything that somehow grew up around him over 26 long years. If you enjoyed the video, make sure to subscribe, and I'll see you in the next one.